Hi, this is Sarit Switzer, and welcome to the It Is Taught podcast, a podcast devoted to the teachings of Rabbi Shneur Zalman of Liadi as recorded in his most famous work, the Tanya. My hope for this show is to make these teachings accessible and relatable to the average person, regardless of prior Jewish education or affiliation. The episodes follow the prescribed daily study portions and are meant to serve as practical lessons in how to live your life as your true self and develop an authentic and powerful relationship with your Creator. I have personally experienced the effects the study of this work has had on me, and I'm excited to share what I can of this knowledge with you. So please join me on this journey of learning, self-growth, and connection with your source. Hi, and welcome to the It Is Taught podcast. This is episode 284 for the 6th of Elul in a leap year. So I want to ask you guys a question. What is beauty? So there's been a lot of studies into this idea. What do we consider beautiful? People have the often quoted study is the idea of symmetry, symmetrical faces. But actually, from my understanding, this has actually been a little bit debunked. And while symmetrical faces can be appealing to the eye at first glance, it's actually sometimes a slight asymmetry that makes a person beautiful. There's this website that I once came up across that I found really fascinating, where it took different celebrities who are considered to be really attractive, who most of us really think of as beautiful, and it took their faces, and first it showed the face as a regular, this is their face, this is what we know of as their face, and then it showed their face where they actually made the right and left sides of their face totally identical. So you may or may not be aware of this, but actually the right side of our face and the left side of our faces are never totally identical. They're never perfect mirror images of each other. Usually one side of the face is a little bit tighter than the other side. The shape can be slightly different. The eyes can be a little bit different. There's actually a quite vast difference between both sides of a person's face. For some people to a greater extent, to some people for a lesser extent. So anyway, going back to this website that I came across, it was really interesting because what they did is they took these celebrities who we usually think of as beautiful, and then they showed us a picture of them where their faces actually were totally symmetrical, were 100% mirrored images of each other, both sides of their face. And interestingly enough, they actually weren't as beautiful anymore. They actually seemed kind of weird. There was something off. So I think this points to a really interesting concept, which is something that we're going to be talking about today, because today's topic is actually all about beauty from a godly perspective, that beauty is not as simple as just symmetry. When you go to an art museum, if you were to just see a piece of art that is just a bunch of really symmetrical lines, it's not that interesting. It's not so what's so fascinating about that? What makes something beautiful is that there's complexity, there's depth. There's nuance, there's conflict. Why do we like watching different stories? If there's a movie that you watch and the story unfolds and it's very straightforward and it's just this happened and that happened and then everybody lives happily ever after, that's not interesting. There always needs to be some kind of conflict, and that's what makes the story interesting. That's what makes life beautiful. Music is like this. Everything is like this, really, in this way. On the other hand, conflict in and of itself does not make for beauty, right? This might sound really commonsensical, but it's just because you have two things that are really opposite each other, that doesn't automatically create beauty. There needs to be a third factor in there. What is that third factor? The third factor is the resolution. Again, going back to you watch a really good movie, you read a really good book. There's a buildup, something happens. Oh no, the main character almost let's say in romantic comedies, you often see this, that it's it starts off, they meet each other, everything's going well, and then something happens, some major catastrophe, something like that, where they almost break up. And then there's some kind of resolution, then they get back together. So what is that resolution? What is that third factor that comes in and brings and reveals the beauty inherent in these opposites? This is what we call harmony. And this place of harmony, or in Torah, this is associated also with compassion, actually comes from a place that's above both of these two opposing forces. It comes from a place where they are actually sourced in. And so now I want to bring it back to a discussion that we started having yesterday, where we started talking about opposing forces. We were talking about the opposing forces of water and fire, or on a deeper level, the opposing forces of Chesed, which is this extroverted, outgoing outpouring of energy, and Gevurah, which is the polar opposite, this idea of restraining, withdrawal, of holding back, constriction, all of that. And we began to allude to the fact that perhaps somehow God makes peace between these two attributes. Today we're going to talk about how he does this. How is this peace manifest? And the simple answer really is that while these two things are attributes, these attributes have a source, and their source is in God. So we've spoken about quite at length in different parts of the Tanya about how there's God, and then God manifests himself through his different attributes, and how all of God's attributes are really one with him. They're really all encompassed within him. But so while the attributes are encompassed within God, God is not encompassed within his attributes. God is not limited by any one of his attributes. So there's a space kind of within God, so to speak, where we can say that God is above his attributes, where God is surrounds all his attributes, and they all unify. They all come together in this harmony because they're coming from the same place. So we can think about this again, that analogy that we brought up with a parent, where you see the parent hugging their child, and then you see the parent disciplining their child. And while this might seem really opposite, really totally very contradictory actions, in the source, both of these things are coming from the parent's love. So today we're going to learn about that source. Today we're going to learn about that aspect of God, which is the source of these two attributes, which causes them to blend and to harmonize. And this is actually another attribute, which is interesting. We also call it an attribute, but it's a different kind of attribute because there's something a little bit more essential about it to God's nature. This is the attribute of compassion, of Rachamim, of Tiferes, we call it. It's a unifying force that unifies and reveals the source of the other two attributes. So let's get into the text and see how the Alter Rebbe explains all of this. And so for context, we are in the middle of Epistle 12 of Iggeres HaKodesh. And so the Alter Rebbe begins by referencing back to yesterday's section where we brought up this idea of the two opposing forces of Chesed and Gevurah, as we mentioned, of Michal and Gavriel, of water and fire. And then we see that while these two attributes are really in truth very different, very not only different but very opposite to one another, then we know that God actually makes peace between both of them. Meaning, how does he do this? He does this through revelation, because he reveals to them this radiance that is so great that comes from the infinite light of God. Because like his name, so is he. So what does that mean? Like his name, so is he. So meaning to say that the same way that we call God infinite, we say that God is infinite, then this means that God is truly infinite. It means that he doesn't have a measure to him. And interestingly, there's a little bit of a play on words here. The word in Hebrew for measure is midah, which is the same word for attribute, midah, midos. So I think that's interesting because whenever we talk about a specific attribute, it's like we're kind of imposing a limitation. We're giving like parameters, like kindness has a very specific definition to it. Severity has a very specific delegation of what that is. But God is above these limitations. God is above, he transcends to an infinite degree all of his attributes. Even when we get to the really high attributes of Chochmah, Bina, and Das, which is the source of all the attributes. Chochmah, Bina, Das, remember, is the intellectual attributes of God. So they are the source of what we commonly refer to as the attributes, quote unquote, which is the emotional attributes. And so thus, when we go back to these oppositional attributes of Michal and Gavriel, then they become encompassed in their source above, and in their root, and they become one. They become truly unified and become totally nullified to God's blessed light that shines within them in a revealed state. And so thus, what happens then, when these two forces become unified within God's within their source, which is within God, what happens? Then these Gvuras become sweetened and become kind of mellowed within the chasadim, within the kindnesses. And how does this happen? How does it happen that the Gvuras becomes sweetened within the chasadim? This happens through an intermediary, a a memutza, it's called in Hebrew. And what is this intermediary? This is a line that leans slightly to the side of chesed. It's like a little bit biased towards the side of chesed. So meaning this is the attribute, in other words, of Rachamim. This is the attribute of mercy. So it's interesting that even within its source, the source of these two things, there's a bias, and that bias is towards the right side. The bias is towards the side of Rachamim. And this source that we're talking about that unifies both of them is this midah of Rachamim, of compassion, is also called the name of beauty. It's called the name of Tiferet according to Kabbalah. So if you look at that like outline of the structure of the Tiferes, then this attribute which unifies the right and the left is Tiferet. And why is it called Tiferet? Why is it called beauty? So this brings us to the discussion which we started talking about in the introduction, because this level of Tiferet is made up of two shades. It's made up of white and it's made up of red, which allude to Chessed and Gevurah, which allude to these two attributes of Chessed and Gevurah. So again, going back to our discussion about beauty, it's like if you just have one color, that's not beautiful. If you just looked at a painting and the whole painting was white, like what is it? There's nothing there, right? It only becomes interesting and beautiful if you add another color there, if you add another shade, something else going on. That's what makes beautiful, when you have this push-pull of the oppositional forces. And so this is what Tiferet is. Tiferet is this harmony. This is why Tiferet is made up of these two colors of white and red to allude to this harmony of opposites. And so now the Alter Rebbe goes on and he says that this is why, now we can understand when we talk about the name of God, the Tetragrammaton, the Yud-Kei Vav-Kei, Havaya, and we see this throughout the Torah, this is actually a reference to this attribute of Tiferet, as it's stated in the Zohar. So we see this often, right? Like we've spoken about how God has many different names, and each one of God's names have a different association with his attribute. Like the name of Elokim is associated with God's Gevurah. The name of the Shechina is a reference to God's, or Adnos is a reference to God's Malchus, God's power of Malchus. So there's different names of God that allude to different attributes of God, to different ways that God manifests himself. But there's one name, which is kind of like when we reference God, when we say like Hashem, it's like Hashem is an abbreviation. It's sort of a euphemism for this Yud-Kei Vav-Kei, this Tetragrammaton, which we know is like such a holy name that we don't even pronounce it properly. It's kind of what we think of as like the most essential name of God. And so what the Alter Rebbe is teaching us here is that this essential name of God, it is also associated with an attribute. The attribute it's associated with is this attribute of Tiferet, of beauty, of Rachamim. And so this teaches us that there's something about this midah of Tiferes, there's something about this attribute of beauty, of harmony, that is more radiant and more manifest than any of the other attributes of holy attributes of God. So it's not just another attribute like any of the other attributes. It's special. It's different in some way. So that's it for today. That's the end of the section. So just again to recap, so we're getting into this deeper discussion about the harmony of opposites and into what it means, what peace means, and if you remember yesterday, this is in the context of a broader discussion where we wanted to get into what this idea is that doing tzedakah versus service of tzedakah, what the difference is, and how the act of tzedakah brings peace versus the service of tzedakah brings quiet and certainty. And we're trying to understand the difference between the two. So today we got into a little bit of this discussion as to what is peace exactly, and how it is that God makes peace between these two oppositional forces. So that's it for today, and we will continue along these lines tomorrow, and I will speak to you then. Thanks for listening to the It Is Taught podcast, hosted by Sarit Switzer. This podcast is dedicated in loving memory of my maternal grandfather, Avraham Yitzchak ben Binyamin HaKohen of blessed memory. Music by Shoshana. If you enjoyed this episode and would like to support the show, please share it with others and subscribe on YouTube, Apple iTunes, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts. And make sure to leave us a 5-star review. To find out more about the It Is Taught project, including more information on my soon-to-be published book, please visit our website, itistaught.com. To catch the latest from me, follow me on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Looking forward to speaking with you tomorrow, and until then, have a great day.